Well, it is my honor to introduce to you Shawn Ellison. Shawn Ellison is a Christian mystic of nearly 20 years, a Catholic convert, a pediatric oncology nurse, a certified Enneagram practitioner, and an integral coach. He belongs to the Christian contemplative lineage of St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila and Bernadette Roberts, who he'll be speaking on today. His vocation lies in helping Christian contemplatives experience the grace of transforming union. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with his wife, Carmel, and his daughter, Genevieve. So welcome, Shawn. So glad to have you here.
Thank you, Keith. I feel very honored and privileged to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, yes. Great, great. Well, as we're starting all of these conversations, we're asking our friends here the same question for you to define what is a mystic.
That is a great question, and it's not a simple one to answer, at least for me. A mystic, for me, is someone who has the direct and experiential knowledge of God. And God here meaning ultimate reality, ultimate spirit, absolute truth. And so it's really someone who is conscious of the divine in a way that goes beyond concepts. A lot of people are scholars of mysticism and contemplation, never have had a true mystical experience or encounter. And so for me, the definition really centers around that experiential contact with the ultimate reality.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that. That need for experience for me is also the critical piece. I mean, it's a difference between looking at a photograph of a river and jumping into the river and experiencing it for yourself. So
Right, exactly. And I will also add, Keith, that to be more specific, a Christian mystic, in my view, is someone who experientially and mystically recapitulates the life of Christ. And what I mean by that is somebody that is actually reliving the interior experience of the human Christ. And so it's someone that's actually following all the milestones, oneness, living out that oneness, being in the marketplace, dying on the cross, resurrection, ascension, the Eucharist. And so it's really someone that is mystically privy to the experience of what Christ went through in his human form. And it's that identification through baptism that makes a Christian mystic a Christian mystic. So it's definitely a little differentiation there when we talk about what is a Christian mystic in particular, because it's very distinct from just mystic in general. And so as we'll talk about, it's someone that's living all of these interior changes that we find in the Gospels, and they're knowing that consciously, and they're living that in a very deep and profound way. And so that's what differentiates mystic from Christian mystic.
yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I love that word interior because it's like put on the mind of Christ.
Right.
That's the invitation. Well, so beautiful. I want to introduce our topic for the day. We're going to be discussing a great modern mystic, Bernadette Roberts, somebody who I know you got to work with personally in the flesh, which is beautiful. In particular, her sort of unique teaching on what is beyond the unitive state. So I guess just to sort of set the stage for us, could you give us sort of an overview of what is the unitive state? Where does it come from? And maybe where is it leading us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the unitive state is a Christian term that describes our experiential oneness with God. And it's a term that goes back, probably over 1,000 years. And it's a term that really speaks to the experience of oneness and union. And we say unitive, right? It implies a duality, right? There's a subject and an object that are coming together and they're coalescing into a singularity. So the term unitive is implying that there's two coming together. Now, we know that we all are pre-existingly one with God. But the unitive state is a state whereby that becomes a conscious knowledge. It's not any longer just something that I'm aspiring to realize or am trying to realize or that I know as a concept. God brings this into an experiential focus and view. And when that occurs, it's a transformation of our awareness. It's something that when it occurs, we're the new creature in Christ, so to speak. And it's that recognition of that oneness that changes everything. And I don't think many people really understand just how profound it really is. I think sometimes we talk about unitive states as like a passing glimpse, whether you're in nature or something, you have an experience of an intimate moment with God. And that could be a unitive moment that we have in our lives. And most of us have unitive moments from childhood throughout our lifespan. But the unitive state in the Christian mystical sort of framework is focusing more on the conscious recognition. St. John of the Cross calls it supernatural union, because God is bringing us into the experiential understanding and knowledge of that state. And so Bernadette Roberts is so amazing because she was also a Carmelite nun when she was a teenager into her mid-20s. And she's a person that experienced this at a very young age. She was 17 years old when she went to the convent to pursue this goal of becoming one with God. And she was in the convent for 10 years. And so she has a rich sort of background in the Carmelite mysticism of John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. So she's in many ways a continuation of their work. You know, she often wrote that where they end, she begins. And so the unitive state is very simple in experience, but it's very hard to articulate, because in its simplicity is like, you know, you're living it, and it's something that you know, like it's a sixth sense. You're living this oneness. If these are talking about or other people, they're kind of like, whoa, like this is so complicated, and it's really not. And so the first thing I would say about the unitive state is that it's the continuous passive awareness of God within. What that means is that awareness of God at this level is no longer a focus or practice. You know, earlier on in the earlier stages, purgation, illumination, we're aspiring to bring this oneness into view. We're trying practices, whether it's Lectio Divina, whether it's a centering prayer, whether it's a breathing practice, meditation practice. We're trying to stabilize this in ourselves. And we know that it's not permanent because it kind of comes and goes. We're trying to stabilize it. But when this occurs, there's a stabilization of that awareness whereby it's 24/7, meaning that we are conscious of God within ourselves, and our lack of separation all the time. It's autonomous, it's choiceless, it's part and parcel of your being. And so you're just waking up in this, you're sleeping in this, you're going to work in this, you're married in this, you're having children in this. There's no separation. And in many ways, this unitive state ushers in the end of spiritual practice. And that sounds kind of radical, like, wow, like no spiritual practice anymore. And the irony is that it's a natural recognition, because once you are brought to this place, you're like, why should I pray anymore? Prayer doesn't add to my life anymore. Why should I fast? Why should I do this? Why should I do that? There's no longer any relevance of practice. And a lot of people find that, I think, unsettling, because it almost implies a hierarchy in some ways, I think. But it's the truth of the condition is that God is like, you're breathing with God every moment. And it's very conscious, and it feels like a joy. It is a bliss, it's a peace that we experience. Our identity and God's identity literally coalesce in this way. So we know we're not God in this state, but we know that we are directly participating with God at that level. And so the unitive state is not static either, which we'll talk about. We think sometimes that, oh, oneness with God is the same every day. Not quite. It's a state that evolves over time. And that's what Bernadette Roberts speaks to.
So good. I'm imagining now Teresa of Avila's image of light pouring into a room, like from the one window of God's light, God's being pouring in, another window our being pours in, and the two lights are one light. And I think that's a beautiful image for me in this way. I guess one question I have, you're talking about this as you know, I like this word continuous passive awareness. And can you speak to that passive part just a little bit more? I mean, is this a state of pure peace? I mean, can we imagine sadness? Can we imagine anger? Can we imagine sin? Can you sin? Is unitive state a sinless state, or is there um, more going on than that?
Yeah, totally. Passive means without effort. That's what I mean by passive, meaning that it doesn't require any maintenance. Before we were reading books, we were, going to mass, or we were, going out into nature, trying to stabilize it. But at this level, passive just means that I don't have to think about God anymore. Bernadette says that it's as if we had to forget God to become more aware of God on a more profound subjective level. What that means is that we literally don't even think about God anymore. God is like something that just drops as an object, because now we're experiencing God in a much more radical inner subjectivity. So it's almost like you and God are like looking at the world together, and there's no longer God out there and, I'm here. It's really a unified subjectivity, which is hard to explain. It's like prior to it, you have yourself, I am Shawn, I'm Keith, and that is who you are. But in the unitive state, there's a sense of a joint partnership. It's almost like a we consciousness, an us consciousness. And so whatever you're doing, there's that unified sense of doing it with God. So whatever I do, there is this understanding that I'm doing it with God, and there is no separation. And so it's really a unified subjectivity, to put it a different way. In terms of the other parts of being human, in the unitive state, we still have thoughts, emotions, feelings. We can still be hurt. We can still experience pain and even suffering, as we see in the life of Christ. But the difference, though, in the unitive state is how we experience those things. So, for example, in the unitive state, there's a certain threshold, and that threshold is the divine center. This unitive state, we're living at such a level in ourselves. It's almost as if we go so vertical that we hit the bottom of ourselves. And that's where God is. And that's where we live. And on the outside of that center, it's mind, emotions, feelings, right? Our experiences. We still have desires, we have passions, drives, and all these other human things, which are not bad things. The difference, however, is that the unitive state regulates the reactivity part. The reactivity piece changes. So for example, say for instance, someone lied to you or something and they betrayed you, right? There could be some sense of like, wow, that hurt, right? But that pain will hit that threshold. And at that point, it dissolves in God and becomes joy. And so it's almost this protective mechanism in the state where it's like, no matter what we experience, pain, suffering, it hits that threshold. Normally, though, in the prior states, there's that reactivity that has no end, right? It just keeps going and going and going. We got to try to breathe and regulate ourselves and take time for ourselves. So we're trying to get out of that state. But the unitive state, one of the gifts of it is that whenever we are triggered, whenever we are in some ways reactive, there's a certain point beyond which it cannot go. When that takes place, we meet God. And so we find here is that truth, positive and negative. So say you get married, right? You have a child, very happy moments. That hits the threshold as well. And what God is revealing to us at this level is that God is our deepest experience, period. It is not, being married, is not having a child, is not even on the other side, our reactivity is that both poles of the human experience, they dissolve at that threshold and become joy and bliss. Mm-hmm. And the result of that understanding, Keith, it makes you fearless, because you're like, oh, I can just do whatever I want to do in life and I can never be hurt. Because if I take a risk or something and it's a bad outcome, the worst thing is that I meet God there. So it's literally as if you are free to be fully human, which Bernadette talks about a lot. We're fully human, meaning that no matter what we want to do in life, there's no fear anymore of reactivity or our extremes, because that unitive state modifies our emotional affective system. It's a marvelous thing, actually.
Hmm. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I'm wondering if I'm thinking of Cynthia Bourgeault is a wonderful teacher to me, and she speaks of the difference between going to our center versus living from our center. So like the first half of the spiritual journey is like trying to get centered, trying to find God. And then the sort of switch happens when we no longer have to search. We don't have to go there because we're living from there. Is that a helpful way to think about like permanently living in this unitive state, or is this something different?
Correct. So for Bernadette and the Carmelite mystics, this is an irreversible change, meaning that once we get here, God kind of traps you there. It's like you get into that seventh mansion, which is Teresa's, last room in her interior castle, and God locks the door behind you, and you can't get out. And so basically, it's like you have to learn how to adjust to this, because in the dark night of the spirit, that takes us to this place, so to speak. We're actively trying to figure out what to do. We feel lost. It's like our sense of God has gone away, and we're going backwards, or so it seems. And so as we go through this unknowability in this dark night, and God reveals Himself as the light in the dark room per se, we realize that we're in the seventh room now, and we can't leave. And even if you're trying to bang on the door and try to like pick the door and try to open it, is like, no, God has picked you up and put you there, and you can't leave. And so the only choice now is to surrender to this, right? It's inevitable. Like you have to surrender to this. And once that occurs, life unfolds in a very natural way. So I would say that living from the center becomes a habitual way of being, right? No longer a practice, no longer a focus. It's coming from within, and it's totally natural. And it's the most natural thing. In the beginning, it feels very extraordinary. It's like, wow, like I'm always living from the center. But then as you kind of live it over some period of time, years, decades, you realize that this is just how life is. I'm living life in oneness with God, and that's what it is. Back to your other question, though, you mentioned sin. One thing about this state that's very fascinating is that I wouldn't say that it is a sinless state, right? Because Teresa of Avila really speaks to this well. She says that we are habituated, right, to being with God. But she says that God protects the soul against pride by preserving some weakness in it, so that it always is reminded about what it is. It never forgets its poverty. And I love that, because St. John of the Cross has a much different view. He's very he has a deified view. The soul becomes God. And it's kind of, you read like, what? When the soul becomes God, what do you mean? Right? But she speaks about it in a much more humanistic way, that yes, we are one with God. Yes, we experience this, but God preserves in us some measure of weakness. It's kind of like St. Paul's thorn, where it's like, so we don't get too exalted and feel so inflated by this state. God preserves something in us in order for us to remember, you must depend on me, that this is something that is my doing, not yours. And so strictly speaking, it's not a sinless state. It's very close, but it's not sinless. And even Jesus said, only the Father is perfect, right? And so really, even he knew, I think, that there's something here that prevents that quote unquote perfection. And we see that in ourselves. We aren't like not aware of it. We see this subtle sort of weakness that is very, very hard to see. No one else sees it. Only you see it, really. Yeah. And that's kind of like a secret between you and God. Like, I know who you are, and I'm preserving you, right? And so there's this knowledge as well. So that's my answer to that question. It's not strictly speaking a sinless state, although some people like to say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's so good. And it gives the invitation for gratitude, because I hear you say that. It's like our hardship is grace. Like that weakness that we each feel is grace. Like that even in itself is a way for God to communicate in a sense, right? Because that's the divine reminder in a sense. So now why don't we turn to Bernadette? You've just mentioned her like kind of here and there. Maybe you could give us who is Bernadette? Why is she so meaningful to you in your life, in your spiritual, your practice?
Yeah, Bernadette. She was born in 1931. She died in 2017 from ALS. And I found her when I was in college. I was a sophomore in college, and at that point, I had had a lot of spiritual experiences myself, and I was looking for guidance actively. And I was reading a book by one of my favorite mystics, Madame Jean Guyon, who was a 17th century French mystic. There was a very cryptic line in one of her books that I read, and it said that once we arrive at the divine center, we must depart again from the center of the creature to the center of the creator. And I was like, what? I was like, depart again. I'm like, at that point in time, I hadn't know anything about any no self. I just thought, okay, Unitive state is the highest you can go. And yet she's describing that there's something else beyond this, that we have to travel again to a deeper state than this oneness. And so I kind of sat with that, and I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then the next couple of days, I was just Googling stuff online, and I found this quote by a lady named Bernadette Roberts. And the quote was speaking to infused contemplation, which is the experience of God's light kind of coming into the soul. And it was such a profound quote. I was like, who is this person? And so I looked her up and saw she had books. And I went to a Catholic university. And so we had a library with a ton of Catholic literature. And so I went to the library. I found a book of hers. It was The Path to Know Self. And I opened it, and it started changing my life when I began reading it. And that's how I found her. So as I mentioned earlier, she was a Carmelite nun for 10 years. She attained this unitive state while she was in the convent, but she noticed that while in the convent, she felt that she wasn't growing anymore. She was, okay, there's this unitive state. It's very great. It's nice. It's pleasant. Great. Awesome. But I'm not growing. Like, I'm just doing the same thing. And she realized that she had to leave the convent to go back out into the world. Because her question to herself was, is this state conducive to silence? Meaning that all I do is pray, all I do is sit in silence. Can this state be what it is in the world? That was her question. She was like, I wonder if it's just contingent on my surroundings, right? So she wanted to go out into the world and test herself. She wanted to test the state. So she got permission from her prioress. She left the monastery, went into the world, went into college, got a degree. She got married. She had 4 children, and all the while living this very profound unitive state. When she was about 47, she had an experience where she had these intuitions that self was somehow dying, that the unitive state itself was collapsing. And she didn't quite think it could be a permanent state, because we have these glimpses of this further state, right? St. John the Cross talks about, this beatific vision, right? Seeing God face to face, right? And we have these glimpses in the unitive state, but we don't often think that it's permanent, right? I can talk about that a little later, but she gets to this point, and then herself disappears, and she's left with like this confounded sort of view, like what happened, right?
Well, what do you mean here? Her self disappears. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So for Bernadette, she describes self as 2 parts. The first part is the knowing self, and that is sort of what she calls the reflexive mechanism of the mind, meaning that your ability to be self-aware that you are a person. So I am Shawn, I am Keith, right? Your own thoughts, your own awareness of yourself, right? Your somatic intelligence, all of that is sort of a knowing of yourself, that's self-reflexive. The other part is what she calls the feeling self. And the feeling self is more so on the level of being. It's what we think about when we talk about energy, feeling, emotion, the sense of being sentient, the sense of being in a body, the sense of being an ontological creature, right? So there's 2 parts. There's one part where you know who you are, And then the second part is that you feel who you are. So self for Bernadette is both a knowing and a feeling, and it's both. And for her, when those two fall off, right, what happens? And she was in this place of darkness, was like, I don't know what this is, right? And so she went into the libraries and tried to figure out what it was, and she couldn't find anything that could describe what it was. She went to some Buddhists to try to talk to them about what she had experienced, and they didn't quite understand it. So she knew she had to kind of just follow the implicit wisdom of the experience. And over time, she got the direction that she needed. And for her, this unitive state, it dying, is reminiscent of Christ's death on the cross. When he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? This sense of being abandoned by God. Her view is that the unitive state for him was that death on the cross. And we are sort of re-experiencing that again. It's being recapitulated. And in between death and resurrection is this sense of being lost, where we have to sort of acclimate to life without a sense of having a person or even being a person. And resurrection for her was this sense of coming into Christ's own eternal knowledge, if you will, of the Trinity, which we can describe a little later. But that's pretty much where her life was. And after she went through this, she wrote books about it, 3 books in particular. And then her last book, The Real Christ, is more of a theological book that tries to untangle what is Christ. What does it mean to say that Christ is in the Trinity? And how did the church fathers understand that mystery? So that's a brief sort of overview of her life. She did also have a lot of spiritual experiences as a child. So she was 5 years old, she had an awakening. So she was already sort of primed to go through these experiences from a little child. She kind of traces that development as well, that from age 5, she was having these extraordinary experiences. And so I think for some of us, we kind of come into this life sort of primed for this type of thing. So.
Yeah, and what a great example of somebody that is just a modern day person. Somebody, you said she passed in 2017, but somebody that did start in the monastery in a sense, and then knew she needed to leave that to keep growing spiritually. So here we are as just ordinary people in an ordinary life, trying to do this spiritual journey. And she's such a great example of that, as somebody that left behind the monastic in order to go deeper, because the world was able to do that for her. So she's a great example for me just in that sense. But why don't you tell us, I'm curious how you understand her sort of unique contribution to the spiritual landscape or the contemplative landscape, especially as it pertains to the unitive state, what it means to go beyond that. Traditionally, we have this 3-part path of purgation, illumination, the unitive. So what does it mean that she's offering sort of a fourth world, or how would you frame that?
Yeah, Bernadette wanted to write because the help that she wanted to get, she couldn't receive because there was no one talking about this. And so her hope was to write to future contemplatives that would come upon this predicament. And so her writing is sort of gauged for, those who are coming after. And she was really keen on that, sort of giving back to those who are in the path. And so when I met her in 2012, I was kind of one of those younger contemplatives that was coming behind her or after her, who wanted to understand, what do I have to do, to continue this growth process? Because I had been through the unitive transformation as a young person. And I wanted to understand from her, how do you keep growing? And she was very insightful in sharing with me little tips and things that she writes about in her books, but getting that personal sort of connection and relationship definitely adds a little bit to it. But her contribution really is to completing the Christian map. I think many other traditions are a lot better at describing the higher stages. Christianity tends to stop at a midpoint, but there's so much other territory that's not covered. And maybe only Meister Eckhart spoke to this even a little bit, when he was giving his sermons, which was very controversial at the time. But Bernadette wanted to complete the map. She wanted to make sure that we had a complete Christian mystical overview from the beginning of conversion, purgation, all the way to no self. And so really her books are speaking to how do we go from unitive to no self? And we may even talk about some of those sort of milestones that she noticed in herself and how it went for her. And so in general, she picks up from St. John of the Cross. His Living Flame of Love is his last book that he wrote. And St. John of the Cross described these ecstatic, extraordinary experiences that took place post-union. And so if you read his spiritual canticle, he's describing the soul's sort of adjustment to this oneness with God, this new revelation of it. But once that's completed, his living flame is directed to those who have gotten there and are now beginning to wonder what's next. And so John speaks about these glorious experiences that we can have in the unitive state. It's almost as if we drop out of existence and we're living in God's own dimension of reality. And in Christian mysticism, we do hold that heaven is essentially God's uncreated dimension. And we often say that what that is incompatible with earthly life. Like if you were to experience that, you would probably drop dead. And so when you do experience that, it's so overwhelming, you just kind of black out. You know, there's like a blackout. It's like it overwhelms you and like your senses shut down, your vision shuts down, all senses shut down, your awareness shuts down. It's a complete suspension of consciousness. It's like if someone were to see you in this state, they'll be like, is this person even conscious or alive? Because you're just laying there, just totally out of it. But in these experiences, there's just these foreshadows of glory. It's really hard to describe. But St. John of the Cross speaks to this. And Bernadette read that, you know, as a young person, and she identified with it. But that's where John stops. John doesn't talk about what happens 5, 10 years from now, from this moment. And so the unitive state, when we first get there, and by get there, I mean realize it, right? Because we already are living in it. It's a matter of realizing it. We realize it. The first thing we notice is that we're given these glimpses of a future state, a heavenly state, a state that seems to be incompatible with life. And the gift of this state is that we can go into it at will. Previously, we would kind of happen into it by accident. But now she called it sinking in, where you can sort of, when you're not doing anything, you can just sit, turn inside, and kind of go so deep in yourself that you fall out of self into God's dimension of existence. Drop out, she called it. She would just drop out. And it was hard because this dropping out, it has like a certain magnetic quality to it. It's kind of like urging you to do it. It's like, come on, drop out, drop out, drop out. But if you're in school, you can't drop out because you got to take notes, you got to pay attention. If you're driving your car, you can't drop out, you'll crash, right? And so there are moments in your day where you're not doing anything. You can kind of turn inside and sink into the state and drop out. But when you resist that because you're busy, later on that pull gets stronger. So there are times in your day where you just can't stop it. You just kind of black out. And Teresa of Avila once said, it's like fighting a giant. No power can resist God's power. And so we have to wrestle with this in the unitive state when we first get there. It's like, why am I experiencing two states? One state is this oneness that we've gotten to. The other state is this ecstatic state. It's St. Teresa's prayer of ecstatic union. It's like we're just so out of it that we cease to exist, right? But Bernadette saw that this state was somehow self-serving. She said to herself, I love that I can drop into this glorious state, but what am I doing it, right? It's helpful for me to understand that it's a gift that I have, but it's somehow self-serving. So she began to pray to God to take it away. She's like, God, take away this state. I don't want it anymore because there's still self in it. There's something in it for me. There's some subtle gratification. And for the Christian mystic, the goal is always to serve God selflessly. That means to serve God without anything in it for you. And for Bernadette, she took that to the extreme. She was like, you could sit in this state all day and just kind of sink into it. And she knew there were certain people in the monastery, for example, who had done that for years. They just sit in their little cell and they just sink into this state. And that's all they did. That was their practice. But she thought, well, how stagnating is that to just sit in bliss all day and not go further in the journey? And to understand that there's some type of self-gratification involved with that kind of contaminates the state. And so one day Bernadette prayed and God took it away. God literally said, no more. And that ability fell away. And what happens here is what she calls the critical turning point. And it's so critical for her that without this turning point, there is no self as a possibility. Because when this happens, God removes this gift that we have. And what happens is that in the wake of that, we fall into this like remarkable ordinariness. We go from like this ecstatic experience to this ordinariness. And in comparison, it's like, oh my God, I lost God. But you haven't. She says that God goes underground. And what happens in this underground thing is that Christ is revealed as the subjectivity of union. Because prior to this revelation, we think that it is us that is one with God. It's like, oh, look at me. I'm one with God now. Like I've gotten here, right? But in this revelation, we learn that it's actually Christ in us that is one with God. It is not the person. It's not little old me. It's actually Christ. And that knowledge really kind of cuts a part of self out. Because now you see very clearly now, this whole unitive state is not even about me. Like this whole state, this is Christ's state and not mine. And this is very important because as we're moving in this journey, we start to understand that it is Christ's movement in us to the cross. And we do that by living what she calls the marketplace. So she left the monastery. She knew that to follow Christ more deeply, she had to leave the monastery, go into the marketplace so that she can test the state. And for Bernadette, she believed that trials and suffering in the unitive state was the preparation for no self. It was how we learn to trust God more deeply. So we're kind of moving through life with God, kind of like, you ever seen the ox herding pictures in Buddhism? And when you're on top of the donkey or the horse, you're kind of just going along. And that's how you and God are. You're just kind of going along in life and encountering trials, encountering suffering. And with each trial, the growth in the state is more. You're trusting God more and more and more. Because even in the state, our trust in God is not perfect yet. We have to continue to live with God. God is proving to us that it's with us in every moment. And it's showing us how unbreakable this oneness is. And that's the beauty of it. It's not breakable. This spiritual marriage, it's like God is showing us, it doesn't matter what happens in life. This is unbreakable. And it's that understanding, that trust that is being built over a period of time that prepares the soul to go beyond it, ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Amazing, amazing. I can feel the tension with that idea that Christ becomes our inner subjectivity, that it's Christ experiencing union with God. It's not me, my little I, my little self, my small-mindedness. But it's God experiencing God, that my role, small Keith, small self, is meant to just get out of the way, to open up, to surrender, like surrender in the deepest way possible. Is that one way to frame it? Because I'm trying to understand this self putting on the mind of Christ versus waking up as Christ, already the interior of our own subjectivity. And what does that mean for participation in the Trinity? Because that's something you mentioned before.
Right. So a perfect, I think, scripture for that is, I think, Galatians 2:20, when Paul says, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And that's really what's happening here, where the yet not I part becomes a reality for you, where you realize very clearly that this oneness that I've desired my whole life is not little old me and God, being one with one another. It's Christ alone that is truly one with God. And there's a little death that happens there. A part of you dies when you realize that. When you realize that, this whole journey from beginning to end is not you. It's Christ's movement in us to the Father, if you will. And so this subjectivity is hard to explain. What it feels like is this other intelligence that's inside of you that is contemplating, that is seeing, that is aware of God. And so really, it's almost like a third thing, because you have like your own mind, right? Your own self. Then you have God within you that you clearly see. Then you have Christ there, who's the mystery in between the two of us. It's like, here's us, here's Christ, and here's God. And Christ is kind of a bridge between us and God. But this subjectivity, it's a very deeply embodied subjectivity. It's like this implicit somatic knowing that in me, that knows God, that loves God, that is one with God, that's not me, that's Christ. When you see that, Christ is kind of growing inside of you. It almost feels like a little germ inside that's growing and taking over your body. And when I met Bernadette for the first time, and I was describing to her some of my experiences, and I said to her, it seems to me like Christ is trying to take over my human existence. And she said, that's exactly what it is. It's a takeover, that Christ is taking over your existence. You're being consumed by Christ, this living flame. St. John described the state of union as a steady flame that's burning inside of us. There's like this inner glow, this inner joy, this burning inside of us. And that burning is the unitive state. It's the fire of union that's burning inside of us in the heart. And it's burning continuously. And it's our awareness of that flame that is the unitive state, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so it is this subjectivity that in this flame is the oneness of Christ and God in that flame. And little helpless me is kind of outside observing this. Mm-hmm. And so really the next change that's happening here is that if you imagine a circle and in the center is God, as that center grows and expands, right? And say the outside of it is the circumference, Christ is literally consuming what remains of that circle. Mm-hmm. It's like, as we sit with this and live our life, sometimes you live your life and you realize that a part of me is gone. It's almost like it's very inexplicable. It's like, I feel like some part of me fell away. And there's this sense of loss, like you lost a part of yourself. And it's so mysterious that you're like, I don't even know how to explain that or how to account for that. But it is this sense of losing self, that as Christ is growing inside of us, there's a scripture that John the Baptist once, stated. He was like, I must decrease and Christ must increase. And that's what's happening over time. It's like this flame inside of us is consuming the self. And that's what she kind of realized as she was living this state. She lived for about 30 years, she lived this unitive state. And over time, she recognized how this flame was the most consistent feature of the state. That out of everything that she experienced, it was the flame that never changed, that never wavered. And this flame is a type of strength, because when you're in this state, you feel almost empowered and emboldened by God, because there's this sense of almost invulnerability, invincibility with God. And so this flame is growing inside of us, and this flame is Christ's love for God. And so at some point, the flame becomes so abundant that she gets to this point, she calls it the fine line. And the fine line where it's like, there's this little line that I exist on. On the opposite side is the unknown. Can I ever cross that line and not go back? Mm-hmm. And so the fine line occurs when the flame has become so abundant over a period of time that one more expansion and self is consumed in the flame. And that outcome is what no self is. It is this growing flame inside of us that becomes like this conflagration. It just consumes us. And we don't understand as it is happening how subtle it is. We don't wake up and know like how much flame is there or how much flame is consuming us. We kind of see it in retrospect. It's like 10 years goes by. You're like, I'm not the same. I'm not the same Unitive that I was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so really it's noticing how this flame is consuming the self. And as that happens, the self is being diminished by it. So no self, in a lot of ways, you can say, is Christ's subjectivity no longer in us, but in God. Because we say in mysticism and Christianity that we believe the self is a created structure. Bernadette's view of self was that it was a physiological structure. I think a lot of traditions talk about self as an illusion or as something that we have to see through. But Bernadette believed that self was actually hardwired into the brain, that this was something that was not just a concept that we buy into, but it was something that we actually can't escape. It's something that is put into us. And so throughout her journey, she describes all these weird like brain changes and like brain pressures, and like one time her head was on fire, like all types of really strange phenomena. A lot of like Kundalini stuff almost, where it's like there's all these changes happening on a physiological level. And what I love about that is that it kind of tells us that consciousness is not happening in the vacuum, like it's happening in the human body. And there has to be changes happening on a physical level to support these changes of consciousness. And I don't think we talk about that a lot. Like what's happening to the body, right, as we're going through these changes, because the body is also being transformed. And that's why resurrection is such a powerful revelation, is that the body is different now. And so for Bernadette, just to sum up your question, the subjectivity begins in the unitive state. The flame is growing inside of us. So this subjectivity is becoming more and more pronounced in us. At some point, this flame consumes the self, and now there's no flame, because once the flame consumes what's giving it all the life to remain, the flame disappears. And when that occurs, self's no more. There is no personal God no more. Self is gone. And what is revealed in the resurrection is Christ's subjectivity in the Godhead, and no longer in me. So we could say that the shift is really from yet not I, but Christ lives in me, to yet not I, but Christ lives. And so it's the in me part that dies. And it's actually the subjectivity of Christ that becomes a universal truth, an absolute reality. And so the relative dies, and the absolute or ultimate becomes predominant.
Amazing. Yeah. And I think that line that you said from John the Baptist says it so well, like, I must decrease and God, Christ becomes the fullness, must increase. As you said, I that's amazing to me. I am going to ask where people should connect with you, but I want to ask first, where should people maybe just, you're just introducing folks to Bernadette Roberts. What's a good place to start with her works and her concepts? Is there a good starting point? Is there anything else people should know before jumping on the Bernadette boat that you want to say?
Well, the first thing I would say is that she is not for everybody. Because what she describes is a very specific path. And if you're not on that path, you may not find her that helpful. And so I would say that if you are a Christian contemplative who feels deeply called to the Christian revelation, I would say for sure, like, check her out. But even in terms of like inter-spiritual studies or interfaith studies, I mean, she was always open to discussing no self with other traditions. At the same time, it's like the Christian mystical path is so unique to itself, like any other path that's out there, that unless you actually are fully walking in it, it may not really appeal to you. But I will say this, is that if you're a Christian that wants to give your all to God, she is your girl, because, you know, she is a person I think really epitomizes what does it mean to give up the whole self to God. You know, one time she asked, she was like to herself, have I trusted God too much? Have I given God too much? have I gone beyond what's natural, right? This is a person that has given up everything to know the truth of God. And that's the message of the cross for her, is willing to give up yourself in order to come upon the fullness of God's truth. And so if you're a person that resonates with that, then for sure, she is a person to look into. The first book I will recommend is not her first book, which is The Experience of No Self. It's probably her second book, which is The Path to No Self, where she talks about the dark night of the spirit, and then she goes into the unitive state, and then how that state is experienced. And when that book ends, her first book begins. So that's the sequence I would go, is the second book, first book, and then her third book, What is Self, is like a encyclopedia of self and the Christian revelation. She kind of breaks down terms, and so it's very very technical and kind of tedious, her third book. But the first two are the ones that really, I think, captures her experience in the most clear way.
Beautiful. Thank you, Shawn. Yeah, helpful to have those sort of practical resources to dive into for folks. So, Shawn, where can people connect with you? I know you're an Instagrammer. Yeah, how can people connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on IG. My handle is at the Unitive School, where I post about a lot of different Unitive sort of ideas and things. And then also ShawnTEllison.com. That's SHAWNT Ellison .com is my personal website. If you want to send me a message or ask a question, I'd be more than happy to talk with you.
Awesome. Well, Shawn, I thank you so much. I know I need to go back and re-listen to so much of what you've shared. So there's a real wisdom and articulate voice here, and a really particular voice that I think a certain stage on the spiritual journey that does not get highlighted nearly enough as the work of Bernadette's work, and in some ways yours to do now. So I thank you and applaud you for that, and honored to have you. Thank you, Shawn.
Oh, thank you, Keith.